Traditional women were interested in traditional men who were defined in terms of their achievements, that is, educated, physically fit, and economically stable, evidenced by the ability to keep a job. Thus, men worked so hard for selection by their female counterparts for mating and reproduction. The traditional family unit is based on the biological premises of women having a finite number of eggs, hence the biological clock that culminates in menopause where the reproductive years are over, while men have an infinite supply of sperm, which comes with the burden of paternity fraud. In the mating market, men are the buyers primarily owing to their supply founded on the inability to control sexual energy, while women are the sellers because of their demand. The demand for women in the market makes them the gatekeepers who determine the terms under which sexual activity occurs. The biological foundations of the family, and marriage by extension, restricted sexual activity to long-term committed relationships, primarily because of the high cost of sex. This high cost of sex, evidenced by the burden of pregnancy, which is heavily carried by women, translated into the high cost of sex for men, the cost, in this case, being marriage. Traditional women depended on men for access to valuable resources and had limited control over their fertility, with pregnancy translating to caring for the young. This biological context, therefore, made men the automatic providers and justified why women desired what they desired in men. The interests women had in men dramatically shifted around the 1960s, which completely changed the approach to intimate partner relations because of the invention of the oral contraceptive or birth control pill. The pill gave an edge to liberal thinkers in presenting the individual, as opposed to the family as presented by conservatives, as the basic unit of life. May explains that by 1964, over 6 million women were using oral contraception. The availability of the pill was restricted to married women, probably to still keep families intact by minimizing engaging in irresponsible sexual behavior according to some conservatives. But all this changed in 1972 following the Eisenstadt v. Baird case that extended the availability of contraception to unmarried women. Before this case, there was Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965. Estelle Griswold, executive director of the Planned Parenthood League of Connecticut, and Dr. Lee Buxton, director of Yale University's infertility clinic, were convicted in 1962 for violating the Connecticut Anti-Contraception Law of 1879, which criminalized using or aiding the use of contraception. A 7-2 decision in 1965 termed the anti-contraception law unconstitutional on the argument that it violated women's right to privacy contained in the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments. The decision reserved the right to privacy for married couples to seek contraception-related services. So the Eisenstadt v. Baird case goes like this: William Baird gives a contraception-based lecture at Boston University. Lecturer invites students to the front of the hall to interact with contraceptive materials. Lecturer gives, MCO, a vaginal spermicide to a young unmarried woman. And Baird arrested following the lecture for violation of Massachusetts law that made it criminal for anyone other than a pharmacist or a physician to administer contraception. Massachusetts Superior Court convicted Baird on the grounds of exhibiting and giving away contraception articles. Baird appealed to the Judicial Supreme Court that reversed the exhibiting contraception conviction but upheld the administration conviction. Baird's 3-month sentence on the grounds of administering contraception was reversed by the United States Court of Appeals that termed it unconstitutional. The law forbidding the administration of contraception was abolished by the 6-1 majority ruling in the Supreme Court in 1972 that termed it a violation of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. The right to privacy that formed the appeals in the Eisenstadt v. Baird case was guaranteed by the Griswold v. Connecticut case in 1965 that gave women more reproductive rights and publicized issues surrounding birth control. These cases were among the first to reference women's bodily autonomy and the subsequent reserving the right to privacy and making independent medical decisions by women. The Griswold v. Connecticut and Eisenstadt v. Baird cases that heavily focused on women's bodily autonomy and maintaining the right to privacy and seeking medical decisions laid the foundation for Roe v. Wade that essentially legalized abortion, although the services were restricted to the first trimester of pregnancy. States were allowed to regulate, not outlaw abortion, in the second trimester pursuant to the health interests of the mother. After the second trimester, the fetus was viable and states were allowed to regulate or outlaw abortion in the interest of protecting the potential life, but there were exceptions for maternal health. Justice Blackmun applied the right to privacy highlighted in the Griswold v. Connecticut case in 1965 in arguing for bodily integrity and decisional autonomy. Roe v. Wade was revisited by Casey v. Planned Parenthood in 1992 that upheld women's rights to abort pre-viability, which is up to the second trimester, allowed states to restrict abortion after viability, and guaranteed states' interests to preserve maternal health and the life of the fetus. KC Planned Parenthood adopted the undue burden concept, which was termed as present if abortion was restricted before the fetus was viable. Gonzalez v. Carhart case of 2007 upheld the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2003 that bans the late termination of pregnancy, which is also called partial abortion or intact dilation and extraction in medicine, except for instances where the pregnancy endangers maternal health. Congress found that an ethical, medical, and moral consensus exists in terming partial birth abortion as an inhumane procedure that should be prohibited because it is never medically necessary. The Act defines partial birth abortion as the intentional and deliberate vaginal delivery of a baby through head first or breech presentation to perform an act that is designed to kill the fetus. The Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt case of 2016 entailed the United States Supreme Court declaring 2 abortion restrictions in Texas unconstitutional based on the undue burden concept that restricts access to safe, legal abortion. The accessibility to birth control and abortion services significantly reduced the cost of sex because all the risks associated with sexual activity suddenly disappeared. The cost of parenting was way higher for women since childcare was a barrier to attaining high levels of education and engaging in viable economic activities. The availability of birth control translated into women delaying childbearing as much as possible, increased women's involvement in the labor force, allowed women to be positive role models for young girls, guaranteed women's reproductive rights, and gave rise to dual-earner households. Then there is the article, The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, by Stevenson and Wolfers, which highlights the fact that this is the best time for women ever but their happiness has declined compared to other times in human history and also compared to men, especially in the industrialized world. The sexual revolution in itself has had negative effects on women. The availability of female choice that has reduced the cost of sex has come at a cost for women, especially in terms of wellness. Particularly, Grabovats and colleagues explain that women with 10 or more lifetime sexual partners present a greater likelihood, almost twice more likely, of being diagnosed with cancer or other terminal illnesses. This greater risk of cancer due to multiple partners is based on the fact that the translation of sexually transmitted diseases into cancer is higher for women than men. According to Mayo Clinic, having multiple sex partners and being sexually active below 25 years are risk factors of pelvic inflammatory disease. According to the CDC, 1 in 8 women with a history of pelvic inflammatory disease experience fertility issues. The availability of male and female choice provided by access to birth control and abortion also informs the endorsement of game-playing love, which is more common among men and negatively affects women. These negative effects stem from the availability of cheap sex without commitment, and they include depression, anxiety, and stress. Eberstadt asserts, and I quote, "For decades now," it argues, "the negative empirical fallout from the sexual revolution, while plain to see, has persistently been met with deep and entrenched denial among academic and other cultural authorities." There is the other phrase, the paradox of the pill, in reference to the unforeseen consequences of birth control. The most common unforeseen consequence of the pill is it made sex cheap. Mark Regnerus, in the book Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy, defines cheap sex as the ease of sexual access, as well as the societal perception surrounding the same. Cheap sex is characterized by women expecting little return for sex and men spending or offering little resources to gain access. Akerlof, Yellen, and Karts note that the percentage of births to unmarried women has doubled to 64%, while the ratio of out-of-wedlock births has moved from 3.1% to 18%. The authors note that out-of-wedlock births are a serious concern for social policy stakeholders because children from single-parent homes are more likely to be poor and experience other difficulties over the course of their lives. Akerlof and colleagues also highlight the feminization of poverty, where an increase in the number of out-of-wedlock births, accompanied by the phasing out of the shotgun marriage culture, has raised the burden of pregnancy on women. Prior to the sexual revolution, women had limited choices and men were responsible for their welfare, an expectation that was more likely to be fulfilled than to be breached. Female choice has seemingly been accompanied by male choice, but one group is perceived as empowered, while the other is often presented as lazy. Male choice is based on the availability of abortion and birth control, which then inform the line of reasoning that if they are available, why commit to marriage? The relationships that often ended shotgun marriages now end in abortion. Akerlof and colleagues also observed that dating in the late 60s was brief and presented a greater likelihood of containing sexual activity. The authors associate the rate of out-of-wedlock births to the concept of shotgun marriage, which revolved around resolving sexual activity resulting in pregnancy with marriage and was popular until the 70s. The decline in the rate of shotgun marriages was witnessed at around the time that contraception for unmarried women and abortion was legalized. Akerlof and colleagues argue that the availability of contraception and abortion minimized the incentive of obtaining the promise of a long-term commitment or marriage to engage in sexual activity because the risk no longer exists. Women who, for either religious, moral, or other reasons, choose not to use contraception or see abortion still costs sexual activity highly, but they cannot compete for mates because being open to contraception or abortion practically reduces the cost of sex to zero, highlighting the analogy of who is buying the cow if the milk is given for free in Akerlof and colleagues' assertion, and I quote, "A cost-saving innovation almost invariably penalizes producers who, for whatever reason, fail to adopt it. Thus, women who do not want to be part of the technological wave still have to engage in premarital intercourse without the promise of marriage out of fear that their partners will seek satisfaction elsewhere because engaging in sexual activity is not an automatic ticket to parental responsibility." This phenomenon accounts for Akerlof and colleagues associating the rise of single motherhood to the birth control technology. The authors explain that the job availability and welfare incentive theories only account for a small percentage of the rise of out-of-wedlock births. Birth control and abortion have made pregnancy processes physical choices for women, child support a legal and social responsibility for men, and marriage a social choice for both men and women. The parenting decisions of the father squarely lie on the options available and choices made by the mother. Male choice in the context of parenthood is directly tied to female choice, hence the phrase, "Women today have reproductive rights, while men have reproductive responsibilities." Apart from the availability of birth control and abortion, women's access to valuable resources and opportunities eliminated the need to leverage sex for the same purpose, even though it is still used to access valuable resources today through hypergamy. The traditional women's expectations of a man being an achiever celebrated and rewarded hard work. Looking at sex as a motivation for male achievement could be used in associating male economic disempowerment with the availability of cheap sex. Today, men do not have to work hard to qualify for sex, nor do they have to get married or assume familial responsibility to gain access to intercourse because it is available without all that, hence why it is termed as cheap. The perception of sex as a motivation for achievement is perfectly captured by Sigmund Freud, who asserted, and I quote, "Civilization is built largely on erotic energy that has been blocked, concentrated, accumulated, and redirected in documenting the theory of sexual sublimation." Sexual sublimation is defined as the conversion of sexual energy or drive into human capital. The existence of sexual sublimation is based on cultural norms that restrict intercourse to the fulfillment of prosocial conditions, including securing a job, caring for offspring, and long-term commitment or marriage. Sexual sublimation, apart from providing meaning to human capital thereby increasing it, reduces the destruction of the same capital by enforcing monogamy and responsibility. Sublimation also minimizes the destruction of human capital by reducing the number of sexually demotivated men who are more destructive than their counterparts. Feminists do not really subscribe to the whole sexual sublimation concept based on the claim that it subordinates and objectifies women through their presentation as rewards. However, they fail to highlight the fact that objectifying women as rewards goes hand in hand with objectifying men for their prosocial achievements, which could be simplified by the love for money. Thus, expressing concern for the perception of women as sex objects cannot be separated from the concern of perceiving men as success objects. The feminist stance on sexual sublimation is understandable considering that they champion for the sexual liberation of women, implicit in female choice that has guided the push for female reproductive rights. The sexual liberation of women is founded on women receiving welfare or having their own income, hence they do not have to be dependent on men. However, there is such a thing as hypergamy in women where they are attracted to men who are wealthier or have a higher social standing. The lack of sexual incentives reduces men's motivation to compete for prosocial achievements. Sublimation is tied to the high cost of sex since women cherish attracting a high-value mate, with sex being used as the reward for prosocial achievements such as securing a job and committing to the responsibility of a family. Napoleon Hill, in the book, Think and Grow Rich, studied 500 of the richest men in America to determine the possible similarities between them. The author discovered that the men refrained from cheap sex, a practice termed as sex transmutation. Transmutation acknowledges that sexual energy is natural and inborn, thus cannot and should not be ignored or suppressed, but rather, it should be given the outlet that improves a man. The Marshmallow Test, Mastering Self-Control documented by Michel analyzes the mechanisms that enable self-control in a longitudinal study. Temptation management was divided into hot, for those who are reflexive and unconsciously emotional, and cool, for individuals who are reflective, effortful, and cognitive in their functioning. The study involved young kids at first and used a reward-based system that included one reward that they could have immediately or a larger one that they could have upon waiting. The larger reward included an assortment of snacks and was used to test the children's ability to delay gratification, a phenomenon that significantly predicted their future. For instance, more waiting time as children translated into higher SAT scores, better social and cognitive functioning during their adolescent years, lower body mass index, a better sense of self-worth, more effective pursuit of goals, better coping strategies in frustrating and stressful situations, and different brain scans for areas associated with obesity and addiction. The test is used to show that self-control, which refers to the ability to delay immediate gratification based on potential benefits or consequences, is a cognitive skill that could be innate or learned, and it affects the physical, mental, and general wellness of an individual throughout the course of their lives. Ethnologist J.D. Unwin examined the relationship between sexual permissiveness and the strength of civilization in the book Sex and Culture. The author notes that every functioning civilization prohibits premarital and extramarital sex, with the relaxation of sexual restrictions being accompanied by increased sexual opportunities and the collapse of civilization. Properly channeling sexual energy promotes civilization as members of a particular society become productive. Individuals are required to sacrifice instinctive pressures and impulses for the greater good of society through participation in socially valuable activities. Unwin asserts that limiting sexual opportunities advances cultures upon which civilization is built. The freedom that came with the availability of birth control and abortion eliminated the incentive that encouraged exercising self-control for both men and women. This freedom has reduced man's incentive to achieve, characterized by the idle hands explained by the rise in male unemployment. For men, acquiring sex today has no relationship with maturity in marriage. William Tucker explains that long-term commitments saliently hold societies together by deterring men from engaging in criminal behavior because of the stability that comes with a spouse and offspring. Men retreating from the labor force today can be seen through the normalization of women supporting men in the working age, increased welfare dependency, and worsening of family breakdowns. Thus, birth control has adversely affected male behavior, especially in terms of forming unions, primarily because of the availability of cheap sex. Eberstadt asserts, and I quote, "Women whose husbands are the breadwinners tend to be happier than other women. Men who are married earn more and work harder than men who are single." This graph by the Institute for Women's Policy Research presents evidence of the fact that fathers work more than other men, which translates to earning more. This study by Pew Research revealed that men with children work 7 more hours compared to those who do not have children. This other graph by the Institute for Women's Policy Research uncovers that married fathers work harder than single fathers. Thus, it is evident that committed fathers work harder, and the presence of marriage pushes men to work even more.